Hey everyone, welcome to the Intro to Tech Equity webinar. We're going to wait just a couple of minutes just to let the room fill in, but feel free to hang out, introduce yourself in the chat if you'd like. We're just going to wait for the room to fill, wait for any late arrivals, and we'll get started at about 12:02, 12:03, depending on how quickly everyone is coming in. So just thanks for being here. We'll get started shortly. And I'll repeat this message a couple of times, so sorry if you have to hear that. Hey everyone, thank you for joining our Intro to Tech Equity webinar today. We're just waiting for the room to fill. Feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like. We're just waiting for the room to fill and we'll get started in about a minute or two. Hello, welcome those of you that are just joining us. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We're just waiting for some late arrivals, waiting for the room to fill. So we'll get started shortly. Okay, I think everyone is in already. So once again, hello everyone. Thank you for joining our Intro to Tech Equity webinar. I hope you all can hear and see me. My name is Hermann Calderon. I'm the community manager at TechEquity Collaborative. So in my role, I'm engaging with our supporters and with people in our network through event series, through volunteer opportunities. And now I get to engage with you all here on this presentation today. So feel free to drop in any questions into the Q&A box. Should be on the bottom of your screen as we go, and we'll answer those questions at the end of the presentation. The presentation will also be recorded and will be made available to everyone on the call, as same as with the presentation slides. So we'll share both of those out. So don't worry if you miss something, or if you want to share today's presentation or watch it later, you'll all have that available with a follow-up email I'll be sending out afterwards. So a little bit about what we'll be talking about today. We'll talk about why TechEquity exists as an organization, how we got started. We'll talk about the key issues we've identified in our org to help us understand the problems that need to be solved. And we'll talk about how we can take action to address some of our most pressing economic issues. But first, let's begin with why we're here. Well, TechEquity got started because some of its founders and early members saw these symptoms of growing inequity within their neighborhoods. And they understood that there was this perception that tech workers were the sole and main reason causing a bunch of these problems. So they noticed things such as rising rents, displacement, traffic, and increases in people experiencing homelessness. And as they talked to others within their networks and within their neighborhoods, they realized that they weren't alone in their concern, and that they as tech workers were uniquely positioned to help contribute to solutions that would address some of these issues that they were noticing. And especially now in the face of the pandemic, we're seeing that the affordability crisis gets so much worse with an increased burden placed on lower income people and communities of color. And many of our neighbors are uncertain as to how they'll continue to manage what was already an untenable situation. And at the same time, tech workers have remained relatively unscathed by what's been going on these last couple of years. So as a result, the pandemic has the potential to even further exacerbate some of the inequality that we've seen in our region, like I said, for the last couple of years, and some of the issues that some of our early founders had also seen when they were starting to think about starting TechEquity. And because of this affordability crisis, communities are frustrated, and it really comes to no surprise. I know for myself, I've grown up in the Bay Area my whole life, and I've kind of been able to see both sides of the coin. So I have friends and family who are worried about the changes they're seeing in their communities and what that means for their job security, for their homes, and for the families that they're raising. But I also have friends and family who have pursued jobs within the tech industry and, have found lots of success, really. And we see that when tech is shouldering the blame for a region's issues, it starts to create an us versus them dynamic that's further dividing our communities. And we know that tech workers care and that they want to help and that they don't want to contribute to this deepening divide within our region. So while we're all unsure as to how long we'll be managing this new normal that's caused by the pandemic, it's important to note, like I said earlier, that many within the tech sector have remained relatively unscathed. I think more than most other sectors, tech has been able to make the transition to working from home with little to no disruption. And now more than ever, tech workers and tech companies have an opportunity to support more equitable solutions in our communities. And we have an opportunity to use our unique positions of privilege to support our neighbors, but it's hard to know how to best engage in times of such uncertainty. So this is the state of our affordability crisis in the Bay Area. I think the fact that rents are rising isn't really a surprise to anyone on this call because, we know this, you're either personally experiencing it, people that are experiencing it, you hear it on the news, you're reading it in news articles all the time, and it's on everyone's minds. And while some Californians are very successful in the tech-driven economy here, the average salaries for tenants have decreased slightly throughout the years. And we're showing stats for California because that's where we're based as an organization, and it's where tech is headquartered. But a version of this story is playing out all across the country as we're seeing more and more cities starting to become tech hubs. And it's really a sharp contrast with the narrative of tech success. And without tech at the table to work together to address our shared crisis, it's understandable as to why community members are frustrated, like we just talked about. So right before the pandemic, unemployment was hovering just around the 4% mark, and people were already struggling to make ends meet. And when the virus hit, unemployment claims had spiked to about 16%, which is a more dramatic spike than our last recession. So in the span of a month, we lost about a decade's worth of recovery. And as instability and uncertainty continues, we'll see more of our neighbors being pushed into homelessness or worse. So at TechEquity, we're as optimistic as ever about the tech industry's potential to drive broad-based growth that's accessible to everyone, but it's clear that it's not going to happen on its own. We have to invest in the people and the institutions that are serving our communities, and we have to show up, and we have to do so in partnership with those in the community that are feeling the most pain if we're to dismantle this notion that tech is the enemy. We believe that a more engaged tech sector is a more ethical tech sector, that connecting tech workers and companies to the issues where they live in will result in more engagement in our communities and more ethical decisions at work. So we know we can do this. And the first step is to show up. And you all have done a great first step by signing on to this webinar today and joining in on the discussion. Our goal at TechEquity is to change the conditions in which the tech sector is growing. So we believe that effective structural change will eliminate a culture and policies that have institutionalized inequity, leading to stronger and more resilient communities. We help tech workers approach these big problems and engage in system change in three major ways. So our programs educate you on the most critical civic issues where you live, and we do that in a variety of ways. We host book clubs, we have panel discussions, webinars such as the one you're on today. We produce voter guides around election season, so we'll have one this year, things like that. We also advocate for public policy that rebalances power and builds economic equity. And a perfect example of that was our work on the Tenant Protection Act of 2019, which was a bill that was passed in California, where we worked in partnership with local community members, those most affected by rising rents, and state legislators to pass a bill that now extends protections to over 8 million Californians, preventing unjust evictions and price gouging of rents. And so with our network of tech workers and working in conjunction with community members, we were able to help pass that bill and then provide resources and build tools so that people could access those rights online. And finally, there is corporate practice, aiming to turn companies into agents of change in the broader community. And so we do that through our corporate partnerships programs and engagements we have with different companies. So tech workers have outsized political power that has largely been untapped when it comes to public policy advocacy. So connecting tech workers to outside perspectives is going to build more empathy and ethical practices in our workplaces, in our products, and in our surrounding communities. At TechEquity Collaborative, we focus on two issue areas, which are housing and workforce and labor. So while housing costs are a core part of our affordability crisis, the issues really are intertwined and intersect in a variety of ways, because where you live affects your access to opportunity, and what job you have affects where you're able to afford to live. So at TechEquity, our goal is bold, comprehensive change by companies and government that's led by the tech workforce. And as we talked about, these issues have only gotten more urgent in the face of the pandemic, but we're all well positioned to adapt our agenda to these new realities. So while the pandemic has exposed the cracks of our economy, these underlying issues have always existed in our economy for decades. So let's learn a little bit more about the inequities within our own neighborhoods. The affordability crisis is decades in the making. The policy choices we've made over the course of decades have set us up for this level of pain our community is feeling, especially now during the pandemic. So in the 1930s, the federal government instituted a policy that's still felt today, especially by communities of color and in the Bay Area, in California, all across the country, and that policy is redlining. So redlining was a process in which the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a federal agency, gave neighborhoods ratings to guide investment. And this policy is named for the red or hazardous neighborhoods that were deemed riskiest. So on maps, those neighborhoods were literally redlined. As we can see with the image on the screen, it's showing a map of San Francisco. So all those red blocks are redlined neighborhoods within the city. And those communities that were deemed risky investments or redlined didn't receive any investment. And these neighborhoods were predominantly home to communities of color, and that really is by no accident. The hazardous ratings were in large part based on racial demographics. So in other words, redlining was a discriminatory and a racist policy, and it made it hard for residents to get loans for home ownership or maintenance of their homes for something like building a new roof. And consequently, redlining led to cycles of disinvestment, including development and production within these neighborhoods. So there's a terrible history of underinvestment, underbuilding, and exclusion in our country. And often those communities that have been historically underinvested in and have been redlined are the very same communities that are at risk of gentrification today. As we talked about, the crisis that we're living in is decades in the making, way before tech's arrival. And it's not unique to the Bay Area. It extends across California and across the country. So these are examples of red line neighborhoods in Austin and Atlanta, two up and coming cities within the tech space. Once again, those red blocks all over that map are historically red line neighborhoods within those two cities. So we have Austin on the left side and a map of Atlanta on the right side. So by preventing entire neighborhoods from being able to access this capital, these neighborhoods were unable to build the schools that they needed, small businesses, and a community that fostered economic success and opportunity. And it caused many of the people who lived in red line neighborhoods for generations to fall in and stay in liquid asset poverty. Now you may be asking yourselves, well, what is liquid asset poverty? Well, someone is considered to be in liquid asset poverty if they don't have enough savings to cover their basic expenses for 3 months after experiencing an income shock. And an income shock can be something like a huge rent increase, you suddenly lose your job, or your car breaks down and you have a big bill you have to pay off. And it impacts almost 1 out of 3 Californians. So 33.9% of Californians are in liquid asset poverty, and people of color and lower income people are affected at much higher rates, with 41.2% of African-American households in liquid asset poverty and 56.2% of Latino households in liquid asset poverty. And there really isn't a singular reason as to why this is happening, but as we said, many years of policy decisions have led to these outcomes, which are especially burdensome for communities of color. And these policy decisions have often predated tech's arrival, but tech workers can now take a role in supporting better policies moving forward. The twin forces of a housing shortage, particularly with affordable housing and wages that don't cover the cost of living, have created a regional crisis that has hindered opportunity, growth, and prosperity for families and small businesses alike. And as you can imagine, these statistics will likely be impacted by the outcome of the pandemic because many people in our communities were already struggling. And as pandemic recovery continues to be starkly uneven and unequal, many of our neighbors are facing increased instability and likely will for years to come if we don't implement the necessary solutions now. As we can see, the hourly pay for workers has also not increased much the last couple of decades, even though productivity has dramatically increased. So according to the Economic Policy Institute, the share of workers covered by a collective bargaining agreement or unions dropped from 27% to 11.6% between 1979 and 2019. So meaning that the union coverage rate is now less than half where it was 40 years ago. So this means that employees have less bargaining power to advocate for pay rates in alignment with the work that they're producing. So while all workers have lost out of this, because of this, Black, Indigenous, and people of color are the most impacted. While there is a gap between worker pay and productivity, there's also a pay gap between race. So white men are earning more cents to the dollar. It's that orange bar on the left side of your screen in comparison to Black men and women, the blue bars on the right side of your screen. And because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are getting paid less and disproportionately, they're not able to afford living in cities that are providing good jobs. So the cost of living here were already high. So let's take a look at what a worker earning minimum wage fares in the current rental market. So this is what it takes to afford an average 2-bedroom apartment in San Francisco. So if you're making $133,000 a year, you can afford the average 2-bedroom working a regular 8-hour day, 40 hours a week. However, if you're making minimum wage in San Francisco, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom. Once again, if you're making minimum wage, you need to work 40 hours a day to afford that 2-bedroom. So there's only 24 hours in a day. So we're setting up an impossible situation for low wage workers to be able to afford living in the city where they work in. And this problem persists all across the country. So even though the costs in burgeoning tech cities like Austin, Denver, and Atlanta aren't as high as the Bay Area, the cost of living is still unreasonable for anyone that's earning minimum wage within those cities. And in San Francisco, it's not just people outside the tech sector that are struggling to afford the city. There's this common misconception that all tech workers are paid these lavish salaries. And however, not every salaried employee is making 6 figures. Some salaried tech employees, like those in customer success or in marketing, are paid salaries that are still considered to be low income in the Bay Area. And even further away, if we're pulling back a little from this image of the wealthy tech worker, are the thousands of contractors and contingent workers like security guards, custodians, cooks, bus drivers, who are working long hours to maintain tech companies, but are receiving minimum benefits and are not paid as much. So you have to have a good salary to afford your apartment. But why is your apartment so expensive to begin with? You may be asking yourselves. So rents are going up due in part to lack of supply. And this chart is showing us what we should be building. So the state sets goals for how much housing local communities should build in order to keep up with demand and population growth. And those are called RHNA goals, RHNA, and it stands for Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So as you can see, we're doing a pretty good job at meeting our RHNA goal for the above moderate income housing bracket. That's that big blue bar on the right side of your screen. And that's affordable to people making a really good salary. But we're not building anywhere close enough housing for lower and moderate income people. And those are the 2 small bars on the left side of your screen. So as housing costs have skyrocketed with production of affordable housing not being matched, working class residents and communities of color have been driven out of our urban core and pushed away into the outer edges of our region, further away from job centers and further away from supportive services. and some residents have been displaced from the region altogether. So remember, when someone tells you that you just need to build more housing, it's important that we ask them, build more housing for whom? Again, we're not building enough housing at lower levels of affordability. Because we're not building enough housing that's affordable for lower and middle income people, they're leaving our communities at higher rates, while folks with higher incomes are coming in and staying in. So this chart is showing us how people in lower incomes, those are orange bars, have left San Francisco at higher rates, while people with higher incomes have increased migration into the city. And people beneath 30% AMI are in a more drastic situation. That's that last bar on the graph, where they can't even afford to leave San Francisco, as they're being pushed to homelessness or worse. So that's why last bar is actually increasing. There just isn't enough affordable housing available to support the most vulnerable members in our community. And amongst people of color, and the rates of displacement are even more tragic. However, we can't just rely off of one-off reports as this. This chart is outdated. I believe it's from 2015. So because of this, it's important that we need reliable, consistent data tracking to truly understand the problem of our housing crisis and craft policy solutions that can address some of these issues. So as we talked about earlier, Black and Latino populations are living in liquid asset poverty at higher rates. And furthermore, Black and Latino populations have been leaving San Francisco at higher rates over the past couple of years. So a combination of discriminatory housing laws, such as redlining, low wages, lack of affordable housing production, have created this crisis of displacement. So displacement really is driven by policy choices, and we may see this ratio of displacement continue to rise as the pandemic continues to progress. The folks who are the most rent burdened are in low wage jobs, and unfortunately, low wage jobs got hit the hardest by the crisis. And we can't build our way out to solve our problems, but it is true that we don't have enough homes for people. The good news is that at TechEquity, members are showing up for the community. Tech workers are members of the community and should be at the table working together alongside non-tech community members. And we can advocate for solutions to our most pressing shared problems. So we have to work together to address these underlying issues that are driving inequity in the tech economy. And like we said, tech workers have to show up when we're discussing equity issues. So as you can see, the affordability crisis we're living out today is a result of years and years of bad policy choices. But the good news is that we can make a different set of choices moving forward. So at TechEquity, we envision a world where a growing tech-driven economy creates opportunity for everyone, and where tech sector employees and companies are engaged and active participants in making our communities better places to live. So we've identified structural change that needs to happen in order to achieve this vision, but we won't be able to achieve this without the necessary policy changes. So here's what we've identified in the housing world. We need to take an above all approach to tackling our housing affordability crisis, and that starts with production. So building more housing, specifically at lower levels of affordability. And we can do this through zoning and permitting reform that brings down the cost of constructing housing by removing delays and lengthy administrative processes that make it too expensive to build. Preservation. We need to make sure that we're providing more resources to subsidize and maintain and improve existing affordable housing stock. And finally, protection. We need to protect existing tenants from displacement. So it's going to take a long time to build the housing that we need. So in the meantime, we need to protect existing tenants and renters from being displaced. Racial equity. Racism is embedded in our economic, political, and social system. It's embedded in us all, and especially within the housing space. And that means that we have to be explicit about how racism and racial bias are upheld in housing. So we have to craft policy solutions that are building racial equity in response. Especially now, we have to be thinking about short and long-term solutions to preservation and protection. Many of our neighbors are more at risk now than ever due to the pandemic. We also need to make sure that we all get enough compensation and benefits to live a healthy and stable life. We want to ensure that companies are doing their part to contribute to the communities they exist within. that people in the surrounding communities are able to access these jobs, and that these jobs are paying fair wages and benefits, regardless of the role that the person is in. And we need to make sure that all workers are protected. Within the tech sector, we see these large disparities emerging between headquarters, warehouse workers, and contracted workers. In partnerships with Silicon Valley Rising, we created a standard that tech companies should implement for contract workers, which includes creating space for workers to have a voice, providing career mobility opportunities, good wages and benefits, making sure the workplace is safe, and ensuring that there's fair scheduling. We need to expand and equip the workforce. So training as a standalone approach is not going to lead us out of inequality and will not guarantee employment for most displaced workers. So in order to solve this crisis, we must undertake multiple strategies, massive job programs, high labor standards and protections for all jobs, and innovative recruitment, training, and development of new and diverse talent. At the same time, the tech industry has an imperative to make its employee base more representative of the population at large, not just to create a broader economic opportunity, but because companies with diverse representation at all levels are most likely to be successful than those that aren't. And last, we need to make sure that everyone's basic needs are met. We need a new social contract that ensures that everyone has the basics to survive. We must strengthen our social safety net so that no one falls through the cracks. So once again, this is how we work, and there's tons of ways for you to get involved. So we host educational events and social events. So you can check out our events page to see how much, what kind of events we do and what kind of educational topics we cover. If you're interested in public policy, you can support some of our 2022 priority legislation, which I'll be talking about next. You can support some of our up and coming campaigns that we're currently working on, or you can reach out to me directly, reply to that email sent out afterwards, and I can tell you a little bit more about what we have going on. We can set up a meeting one-on-one and we can talk it out. If you're interested in the corporate practice piece of our work, we offer a wide range of services to companies to provide ways for them to get more involved on these issues, from employee engagement to policy advising. So once again, you can reply to that follow-up email and we can connect you with our corporate partnerships manager. So this is how we work. We try to make it as accessible and as easy as possible to plug in, making sure that you're building community in the process and making sure that whatever opportunity and way you decide to engage in is the best and right fit for you. So this year's key initiatives focuses begins with the Contract Worker Disparity Project. So it's a first of its kind. It's a worker-centered initiative that sheds light on the practice of contracting out and proposes and advocates for public policy solutions and partners with companies to adopt responsible contracting practices. We also have the Tech Bias in Housing Initiative, which is examining the promises and perils of housing technology. So we aim to ensure that technological innovations in the housing space do not reinforce the racist housing systems and policies of the past. We're also really excited to be passing economic justice policy. So every year, TechEquity introduces a bold policy agenda that's addressing economic inequality in the housing market and in the workplace. So our priority this year's are around housing data transparency, equitable labor standards, affordable housing, data surveillance protections, and more. And finally, we have the System Reset Initiative, helping tech companies create on-ramps for people returning from incarceration. So we're partnering with justice-involved people and organizations to get system reset into every tech company in California. So you may be asking yourselves what you can do today. Well, you can do three things right after you get off this call. You can tell a friend about our work, tell them a little bit about what you learned today. You can sign up for a community conversation with me. It's just a one-on-one to talk a little bit more about your journey here at TechEquity and see if there's any opportunity that you like to participate in. Or you can take action with us by supporting some of our priority legislation, which I'll be talking about next. So we'll just jump straight into it. So one of our key bills this year that we're focusing in on is the Pay Transparency for Pay Equity Act. The bill number is SB 1162. So SB just means Senate bill. So SB 1162 is our bill. And that would make pay equity reports public so that all workers have the information that they need to ensure that there is equal pay for equal work, and ensures that companies create a equal playing field for all workers by posting salaries in the job description, posting promotional opportunities to their existing employees before selecting a candidate. So there's different ways to support this bill, so you can keep an eye out for more information. But just to give you an example, this week, SB 1162 was going to face the Senate Judiciary Committee. So we had volunteers call into that committee hearing virtually and on the phone during the committee hearing and voice their statement of support as a tech worker. So that's just one way you can help pass and support legislation such as this as it's moving through the legislative process in Sacramento. And so on events, we don't have currently upcoming events, but as I mentioned, you can check out our events page. There's a past events section, and you can see the recordings of different panel discussions we've had these last couple of months. And so, like I said, you can do 3 things right after you get off this call. Tell a friend about our work, sign up for a one-on-one with me, and I'll point you in the right direction, or take action with us on one of our bills. So I'm sure that was quite a bit of information. So I'll take a minute or two to answer any questions anyone may have. As I mentioned, I'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording to the presentation, a copy of the presentation slides, and links to some of the things that we talked about today. But I'll just stop there for a minute, see if anyone has questions. And I'm also happy to answer questions via email if you think of something later on. So I'll just take a minute real quick. Okay, I'm not seeing anything, which is totally fine. I want to thank you all for joining today. We hope you feel inspired to join a growing movement. I hope some of you hit me up for volunteer opportunities or just see how you can get plugged into our work. Like I said, we try to make it as easy as possible and find the perfect fit for you. We're all busy. We understand that. So we try to make it work for you. And you can support cool stuff, more equitable policies or things that you can work out as an individual on the company side, really whatever works for you. So once again, thank you. Keep an eye out for that email. And I hope to see you soon. Thanks, everyone.